Viewer discretion advised. 21 years of war can hollow out a coastline without leaving a single apocalyptic headline. A generation of hunger winters can turn bread into a weapon. One plague season can erase more lives than a battlefield, quietly, legally, and with paperwork. And then, 2 centuries later, you're handed a photograph. Market Square, Stockholm, circa 1890. Stone buildings, iron lampposts, a street wide enough for crowds, and no people, not a cart, not a vendor, not even the stubborn clutter a living city always leaks into its streets. So don't sell me the bedtime answer first. Don't start with long exposure, like it's a verdict. Because the moral question isn't whether an early camera can miss motion. The real question is sharper and uglier. When Catastrophe breaks the record, who gets to rebuild continuity? And who profits when the rebuilt story becomes law? If you value the historical record, subscribe. When the ledger closes, the bones still speak. Here's the trap this image sets. If you're careless, you jump to fantasy, a hidden reset, a vanished civilization, a world cleared and repopulated like a staged set. It's seductive because it treats the absence as magic, because magic means no one is guilty. But history doesn't need sorcery to create empty streets. It needs systems. It needs incentives. It needs power that can erase without announcing itself. Start with the simplest technical truth. Early photography can make crowds dissolve. People moving become blur, then nothing. Fine. But that explanation has limits, and those limits are where this story begins. A living market leaves residue. It leaves barrels, stray paper, tethered animals, broken crates, a boy who sits too still, a guard who must remain at a doorway. Long exposure can punish movement, but it cannot make urban life behave like it never existed. So if the image feels wrong, don't ask for a conspiracy first. Ask for a mechanism. Because the late 1600s and early 1700s were not a fairy tale bridge between medieval darkness and modern progress. They were a meat grinder of governance. In Northern Europe, you have a climate regime that tightens the margin for survival. Harvest failures don't just mean hunger. They mean migration, debt, theft, riots, and the kind of state response that turns grain into policy. Then you have war, long war, where logistics is the real king. Ports, granaries, wagons, fortresses, requisitions. And then you have disease, plague years that don't just kill, they shatter administration. People die, officials die, scribes die, priests die, registers stop, archives burn or relocate. And once records break, the state does what it must do to keep collecting, conscripting, and ruling. It reconstructs. Not always with malice, often with necessity. But necessity has a moral cost. A reconstructed census isn't just a number, it's a claim. It decides who exists on paper, who owes taxes, who can inherit property, who becomes displaced, who becomes unknown, who becomes a rounding error. That's why we're starting with a photograph, not to prove a mythical reset, but to expose a harder truth. Continuity is not just inherited. In crisis, continuity is administered. And if that's true, then the empty street isn't a mystery. It's a warning. Because the quietest catastrophes don't leave craters. They leave paper seams, the places where a society stitches itself back together and calls the stitches history. Let's do the thing. conspiracy stories refuse to do. Slow down and define the technology before we accuse the dead of lying. Early photography could absolutely make a crowded street look empty. That much is real. In the first decades of the medium, exposure times were long enough that a moving crowd could evaporate into nothing. A person who pauses becomes a smudge. A person who stands still becomes a figure. That's not propaganda. That's chemistry and light. And yet, long exposure is not an alibi for everything. It's an explanation with a boundary. It doesn't erase objects. It doesn't erase the stubborn habits of city life. It doesn't erase the fact that when a street is built wide enough for crowds, the crowd is usually there. Unless something else is also true. The photograph is being taken for a purpose that hates people in the frame. That's the first uncomfortable truth. A lot of early urban photography was not street life. It was architecture and infrastructure. The camera arrived as a surveying tool, a municipal inventory, a way to capture facades, boulevards, government buildings, bridges, and renovations. If the goal is to document the stone, the crowd becomes noise. So photographers waited. They chose mornings. They staged. They asked police to hold traffic. They picked angles that minimized pedestrians. Not because the city was dead, but because the photographer was paid to make the city look like a diagram. And that changes how we read the empty street image. Because the emptiness can be a product of method rather than catastrophe. A city can be bursting with life at noon and still be photographed like a museum display at dawn. But here's where the easy explanation collapses into the harder one. Even when you grant the technical and aesthetic reasons, a pattern still remains. Not proof of a global reset, no. Something subtler, more political, and far more common. States and institutions have always curated what counts as evidence. They commission images that show order, not disorder. They preserve records that justify continuity, not ruptures. They keep the facade and let the bodies disappear into categories. So, the question evolves. Not were there people, but why do our official windows keep framing them out? Look at what emptiness does psychologically. An empty boulevard reads as control. It reads as cleanliness. It reads as a city that belongs to planners and rulers rather than to the unpredictable, sweating, arguing public. An empty government district says, power is calm. Power is permanent. Power does not need to wrestle with crowds. This isn't a technical artifact anymore. It's a visual ideology. And ideologies love crises, because crises give you permission to reorganize reality. This is where we pivot back to the late 1600s and early 1700s. Because if you want a real catastrophe, you don't need an occult correction. You need a continent squeezed by war, hunger, and disease, in an era when administration ran on fragile paper and mortal clerks. War doesn't just kill soldiers. It forces a society to become a supply chain. Grain is counted, horses are requisitioned, roads are militarized, fortifications are upgraded, taxes harden, borders tighten. And when war drags on long enough, it teaches rulers a dangerous lesson. People are not citizens first. They are inputs, labor, bodies, tax units, recruits. Famine adds another layer of brutality. It turns law into triage. Who gets bread? Who gets moved? Who gets recorded? A state that can't feed everyone can still keep itself alive by controlling distribution. And that's where paperwork becomes a weapon. Permits, ration lists, residence rules, vagrancy, displacement. The poor become an administrative problem to be contained, transported, or quietly erased from polite narratives. Then disease arrives, the plague years that snap the spine of record-keeping. A plague doesn't only empty houses, it empties offices. It kills the people who keep continuity alive. Priests who write baptism registers, clerks who file property deeds, officials who maintain censuses. The archive becomes a casualty. Fires and relocations finish the job, and once the record fractures, the state faces an ugly choice: leave gaps and admit discontinuity, or reconstruct and restore the machine. Reconstruction sounds noble. Sometimes it is. But reconstruction also grants extraordinary power to whoever holds the pen, because a reconstructed record is not a neutral mirror. It is a policy decision. What counts as a legitimate birth, a legitimate marriage, a legitimate property claim, a legitimate identity? This is the hinge point of the entire film. When Catastrophe shatters documentation, continuity becomes something that can be assigned, not necessarily invented from nothing, assigned from fragments, inferred from survivors, standardized for governance. And once assigned continuity becomes the basis for law, it becomes self-protecting. Question it, and you are not just questioning history, you are questioning inheritance, taxation, citizenship, and ownership. So yes, early photographs can look empty for mundane reasons, but the deeper issue is not whether a lens erased pedestrians. The deeper issue is that modern societies learned to build a world where absence is administratively normal. People can vanish from images, then vanish into categories, then vanish from memory, all while the buildings stand immaculate and the records claim a smooth, reassuring line. And that's why long exposure cannot be the end of the conversation, it can only be the doorway. Because the real evidence of catastrophe isn't a ghost street. It's the seam in the paperwork, the moment the archive whispers, estimated, reconstructed, adjusted, and expects you to call that whisper truth. Open loop. If continuity can be administered after disaster, then what else gets administered with it? Property, citizenship, or the right to be remembered. If you want a catastrophe, stop hunting for secret timelines and start reading what governments write when they're scared. They don't write poetry. They write orders. They write ration lists. They write quarantine rules. They write requisitions for grain, wagons, timber, bodies. And when the world turns unstable, the first thing that breaks isn't stone. It's the paper spine of continuity. The late 1600s into the early 1700s wasn't a smooth bridge from medieval darkness to modern enlightenment. In Northern Europe, it was a pressure chamber. The climate already squeezed survival margins. Cold years, failed harvests, winters that didn't just inconvenience you, they audited you. Hunger doesn't arrive like a monster. It arrives like arithmetic. Not enough grain, not enough seed, not enough livestock left alive to restart the cycle. Families sell tools. They sell land. They sell children into service. They move. They beg. They steal. And the state responds the way states always respond when the poor become a moving problem. It measures, restricts, categorizes. Then war arrives and teaches that state a second lesson. Hunger can be managed if you control the bottlenecks. Around 1700, the Baltic becomes a strategic machine. Ports, fortresses, supply routes, winter quarters. A long war doesn't only kill, it reorganizes society into a logistics network. Grain is not just food, it is fuel. Horses are not just animals, they are mobility, conquest, taxation on 4 legs. Timber is not just material, it is ships, walls, platforms for cannons, the infrastructure of violence. And suddenly, the city stops being merely a place where people live. It becomes a depot, a ledger, a choke point. This is where your empty street takes on a darker meaning. Not because the city is abandoned by magic, but because war makes a city behave differently. It shifts activity to controlled zones, garrisons, docks, arsenals, administrative corridors. It increases policing. It changes the rhythms of the street. And it produces the kind of record keeping that looks mundane until you realize what it's doing, converting life into inputs and outputs. But the real scythe isn't always war. The real scythe is what follows war on dirty feet. Plague doesn't care which flag wins. A plague year doesn't just reduce population. It breaks the human machinery that keeps records alive. Priests die, clerks die, midwives die, city officials die. The people who certify births, marriages, property transfers, tax obligations, and residence permissions vanish, sometimes faster than the people they were counting. And when the counting class collapses, the archive starts to stutter. Registers stop mid-line. Paper goes missing. Offices are abandoned. Documents are moved temporarily and never return. Fires do what fires do. Renovations misplace what they cannot conveniently preserve. And after the wave passes, the state faces a problem that is both practical and philosophical. How do you govern a society whose memory has been partially killed? Most people think the archive is a vault. It's not. It's a living organ. It requires constant oxygen, staffing, funding, stable buildings, uninterrupted routines, trust in procedures. Crisis starves it. And once starved, it doesn't regrow neatly. It regrows like scar tissue. That scar tissue has a name: reconstruction. A reconstructed record is not automatically a lie. Sometimes it's the only responsible thing left. But reconstruction is never neutral. Because the act of repairing continuity forces choices that look like clerical decisions and function like political ones. If a parish register is missing, whose testimony becomes acceptable proof? If property deeds are gone, who gets to claim land? By what evidence and backed by what power? If census tallies conflict, which number becomes the official reality that taxes and conscription will follow? If a city's documents are adjusted, what happens to the people whose existence depends on being correctly named inside that adjustment? This is where the competitor script tries to leap into a cosmic reset. It points at footnotes like estimated, reconstructed, adjusted, and says, aha, the world ended and was repopulated. But the more brutal explanation is closer and more common. Catastrophe doesn't need to replace humanity. It only needs to break the documentation that anchors humanity to rights. Because the moment your identity is mediated by paperwork, paper becomes destiny. And now we can say the quiet part out loud. War, famine, and plague don't just kill people. They create a second death, the administrative death. The death where you are no longer legible to the system. No entry, no proof, no lineage traceable beyond a point, no claim that survives a courtroom, no voice that survives an archive. That is how a society can look like it resumed without any mystical event. The buildings remain because stone survives better than bodies. The streets remain because infrastructure can outlast a generation. The institutions remain because power always prioritizes its own continuity first. But the people can be reduced to a gap and then reintroduced as numbers that serve governance. So here is the governing question, posed the way empires actually live it. When catastrophe shatters documentation, who gets to rebuild continuity? And how does power turn reconstruction into legitimacy? Because if continuity becomes a policy, then history becomes something the state administers the way it administers bread in a famine. Not to tell the truth, but to keep the machine running. And once you see that, the empty street stops being a spooky clue and becomes a moral indictment. Not what ancient civilization built this, but who benefited from the rebuild, and who disappeared in the paperwork that made the rebuild look clean. Open loop. If the archive is scar tissue, then what lies beneath it? Missing names, missing deaths, or missing crimes that reconstruction quietly forgave. If you want to understand how a world can feel like it ended without a single cinematic crater, stop staring at photographs and start staring at maps. Not the romantic maps, no dragons, no parchment drama, the ugly maps. The ones drawn by engineers and quartermasters, the ones where the city isn't a community. It's a node, a port, a storage throat, a place where grain becomes marching speed. Because the true language of the early modern state wasn't ideology first, it was logistics. And the architecture that spreads across continents in this era, especially the geometry people love to fetishize, didn't spread because a secret civilization reset the world. It spread because canon made medieval walls obsolete and forced every ruler with a coastline to learn the same lesson. High walls shatter. Low, thick walls endure. And angles decide who lives. This is where the star fort enters. Not as aesthetic, but as arithmetic. A star fort is a machine for killing attackers before they reach the wall. Its bastions stick out like clenched fists, so defenders can fire along the face of the fort, creating crossfire that turns a moat into a funnel of death. The shape isn't decorative. It's functional convergence under new constraints. Artillery range, line of sight, and the cost of building something that can take hits. But here's what textbooks often underplay. A star fort is not only a weapon against foreign armies, it is also a weapon against local populations. A fortress is a promise to outsiders: you will not pass. A fortress is a message to the inside: you will be governed. Every fort requires supplies. A garrison eats daily. Powder must be stored safely. Wages must be paid. Roads must be maintained. And once you build a fortress, you build the bureaucracy that feeds it. Suddenly, the town isn't just a place to live. It's a place to be counted for taxes, for labor obligations, for requisition. This is where geometry becomes political psychology. Because the state learns something intoxicating. If you control the choke points, bridges, ports, passes, warehouses, you don't need to persuade everyone. You just need to make resistance expensive. You make movement conditional. You turn space into a permit system. And that is the heart of the era the competitor script wants to mystify. The late 1600s and early 1700s are full of exactly this. States tightening their grip through war-fueled modernization. Fortifications expand not because the world was inherited, but because rulers were terrified of losing what they already had. The Baltic, the North Sea, the Adriatic. These are not just bodies of water, they are arteries. Whoever clamps them controls the flow of grain, timber, iron, and men. Now look at the Star Fort again with that in mind. It's not a standalone object, it's part of a system. A fortress implies a port implies customs. Customs imply paperwork. Paperwork implies identity. Who belongs, who pays, who can travel, who must be detained. So when you see similar fort geometries in different regions, you're not seeing proof of a hidden unified empire. You're seeing proof that early modern states were learning from one another through engineers, manuals, pattern books, captured plans, hired specialists, and the simple fact that artillery makes the same demands everywhere. And once you accept that, the reset hypothesis starts to look like what it really is, a refusal to face a more disturbing truth. Because there is nothing romantic about this system, it runs on bodies. Fortifications require labor. Diggers, masons, carpenters. The work is seasonal, brutal, and often coerced. It requires quarrying and hauling, and every stone is a tax on muscle. In crisis, the line between paid labor and forced labor thins. The state doesn't call it slavery. It calls it duty. It calls it corvée. It calls it service to the crown. But the body feels it the same way. As a life spent feeding a wall designed to enforce someone else's security. And the wall does something else, quietly. It changes the psychology of the governed. People adapt to permitted movement. They adapt to checkpoints. They adapt to the normalization of being inspected. They adapt to the idea that the state has the right to ask, where are you going? Why? With what goods? Under what name? This is how catastrophe becomes governance. After war and plague shred records, fortifications and the bureaucracies around them become the skeleton that holds society together. They create the impression of continuity because they enforce routine. Taxes collected, passes issued, supplies counted, bodies conscripted. Now you can see why the empty street image is so potent. It hints at a world where the human presence is subordinate to the built environment. A world where the city exists to serve systems, not citizens. And that is not a mystical inherited civilization. That is the early modern state in its most honest form. Grandeur built to make obedience feel normal. So here's the pivot we need before this gets comfortable. If fortresses were the geometry of external defense, what city was built as the geometry of internal transformation? An entire capital designed as a weapon? Because once you see that, Stockholm's quiet stops being spooky and starts being legible. Open loop. If the fortress turns space into permission, what happens when a ruler decides to build an entire metropolis as a permission machine? Fast, brutal, and on purpose. Here is where the reset story breaks, because reality is worse. You don't need a vanished civilization to explain a city that appears too fast. You need a ruler who treats time like an enemy and human bodies like fuel. St. Petersburg is not a mythic inheritance. It's a strategic wound cut into geography. Founded in 1703, at the start of the 1700 storm, we have a city built with a military purpose so blunt it should make you uncomfortable to admire the skyline. A window to the Baltic, a knife pressed against the old order, a capital moved like a chess piece to force a new future. That's what empires do when war teaches them that access is power. Ports don't just receive goods, ports receive legitimacy. Whoever controls the mouth of trade controls the throat of money, artillery, and diplomacy. And if your enemy dominates the coastline, you don't merely develop. You invade your own swamp and demand a city from it. This is the part the romantic narratives soften. They show palaces and boulevards, they whisper vision, they sell genius. But a city built under wartime urgency isn't just vision. It's command. It's compulsory mobilization. It's coerced labor. It's death counted as an acceptable expense. Because the project is framed as survival of the state. You want to know how a capital can feel impossibly mature. Because it isn't grown like a village. It is imposed like a fort. When a normal city develops, the street follows the market follows the people follow opportunity. The timeline is messy. The architecture argues with itself. You can see improvisation in the seams. When an imperial city is built as a weapon, the order reverses. The plan comes first, the stone comes next, and the people are poured into it like contents into a mold. This is the psychology of Peter's moment, the belief that society can be engineered the way artillery is engineered, measured, disciplined, standardized, and now the moral cost, the part your eyes are trained to step over. This kind of construction requires a state that can do three things simultaneously. Extract resources at scale, timber, brick, stone, iron. Move labor at scale, workers, soldiers, forced peasants. Keep the project alive through crisis, war, disease, winter. That third point is the real horror. Building fast means building through death seasons. It means a winter where fingers split, lungs fail, and logistics still demands output. It means a summer where disease thrives in wet ground and the work does not stop. It means quotas that don't care if the body is sick, as long as the wall rises. And here's the political psychology. A ruler who can build a capital this way doesn't just demonstrate wealth. He demonstrates sovereignty over biology. He signals to elites and commoners alike. I can reorder nature, and I can reorder you. That's why St. Petersburg matters to our story. Not because it proves a hidden global architecture, but because it demonstrates a mechanism for the impossible timeline feeling. Rapid, unified execution can happen when the state is willing to pay with other people's years. Now connect this back to our governing question about broken records. A city built in a burst like this has an administrative problem. It needs population. It needs skilled hands. It needs clerks, builders, sailors, guards. It needs a tax base and a supply chain. And in the wake of war, plague, and famine, records are unstable. So the state does what it always does. It enforces legibility. It standardizes addresses. It mandates registration. It tracks movement. It assigns roles. And suddenly, the census isn't merely a count. It becomes a tool of urbanization. People moved, enrolled, fixed in place. The city becomes a sorting machine where identity is converted into state-readable form. If you've ever wondered how populations can appear in a place faster than birth records alone could explain, start here. Not supernatural insertion, but forced concentration, migration incentives, and administrative capture. Because when a capital moves, the gravity of power moves with it. Jobs follow, courts follow, contractors follow, and the people, especially the vulnerable, follow because survival follows. So here's the confrontation you're supposed to avoid. St. Petersburg is a monument to progress and a monument to coercion at the same time. The marble does not cancel the body count. The boulevards don't absolve the labor. This is why conspiracy narratives are comforting. They replace guilt with mystery. They let you say reset instead of saying extraction. They let you say inheritance instead of saying forced modernization. But our question isn't who built it, like we're shopping for a lost civilization. Our question is, what kind of power builds like this? And what kind of history does it require afterward? Because a city imposed as a weapon must be justified as destiny. Its costs must be made invisible. Its dead must be uncounted or reclassified. Its paper seams must be stitched smooth so later generations can admire the skyline without tasting the mud. Open loop. If a state can build a capital by treating people as material, then what happens when it turns the same administrative force toward the population itself, counting, relocating, correcting the record until reality matches the plan? You've been taught to treat a census like a mirror, a neutral instrument, a polite head count. How many people live here? As if the question ends at curiosity. That's a child's understanding. In a state forged in war and crisis, a census is not a war. It is a weaponized definition of reality. It decides who exists in a way the government recognizes. It decides who can be taxed, conscripted, evicted, fed, punished, or ignored. A census doesn't just count bodies. It creates categories that bodies are forced to live inside. And once you understand that, the competitor script's obsession with census anomalies stops being spooky and starts being political. Because yes, historical censuses contain margins that whisper estimated, adjusted, reconstructed. Those words are not proof of secret civilizations. They are proof that the state was doing what it always does when the world becomes unstable, maintaining legibility, keeping the machine running, even when the human reality underneath it is chaotic. Think like a quartermaster for 30 seconds. War requires predictability. Predictability requires numbers. Numbers require paperwork. Paperwork requires people to stay put long enough to be counted. But war, famine, and plague do the opposite. They make people move. They make people disappear. They make households collapse, names change, villages empty, refugees flood into cities, and the poor become a tide the state cannot fully track. So the state does two things at once. It tightens control, passes, permits, residence rules. It fills gaps, estimates, reconstructions, corrections. This is where the moral cost hides. Because a corrected number isn't just a technical patch. It becomes the foundation for law and property. It shapes where soldiers are drawn from and where grain is shipped. It decides which neighborhoods are overcrowded, which families are vagrants, which people are unregistered, which children are unknown origin. If you want a line that stings, here it is. A census is a border drawn around personhood. Inside the border, you are legible. You can inherit, petition, marry, own, be counted as a loss when you die. Outside the border, you become administrative noise. And administrative noise is the easiest thing in the world to mistreat, because harm against noise doesn't feel like harm. It feels like housekeeping. Now return to the period scene we've been circling, late 1600s into early 1700s. Records break, offices burn, clerks die, wars rearrange territories. People move under pressure. In that environment, a state can't afford to say, "We don't know, not for long." "We don't know" means taxes fail, conscription falters, property disputes explode, and legitimacy rots. So, reconstruction becomes governance. A missing parish register? You replace it with affidavits, with community testimony, with most likely. A disputed property line. You decide whose claim the court will treat as continuity. A shaky population tally. You publish an official number because officials need a number to plan, whether it reflects living truth or not. And this is where the psychology gets ugly. Once a reconstructed number is printed and used, it becomes real in practice. It organizes resources. It enforces obligations. It shapes lives. Then it is cited by later bureaucrats as if it was always true. Then historians inherit it. Then textbooks present it as a clean staircase of progress. That is how continuity becomes infrastructure. Not because it was never broken, but because the break is politically expensive to admit. So when the competitor script says, "Look, census margins show reconstructed estimates," the honest response is, "Of course they do." That's what happens when the archive is wounded. But the real question is not whether reconstruction happened. It's what reconstruction did. What did it do to the poor? What did it do to migrants? What did it do to people whose names weren't stable, whose lives weren't documented, whose births happened outside institutions? Because here is the unromantic truth. The more a state modernizes, the more it depends on paper identity. And the more it depends on paper identity, the more vulnerable you become if you lack it. In that sense, catastrophe doesn't have to wipe out a population to reshape society. It only has to force a transition where paper becomes the gateway to rights. This is how the empty streets and orphan systems and world fairs will later lock together. Not through a secret reset, but through a visible transition from community-based identity to institution-based identity, from lived continuity to administered continuity. And that transition has its own violence. It's just not always bloody. Sometimes it's bureaucratic. A child classified as origin unknown. A family line that ends not because ancestors didn't exist, but because the archive cannot or will not carry them further. So, no, a census anomaly does not prove a vanished civilization, but it does prove something that should bother you more. Power can rebuild reality after disaster, and the rebuilt reality becomes law. Which means your identity, your inheritance, your history can be as stable as the institution that writes it. Open loop. If a number can become destiny, then what happens when disaster gives the state permission to redraw the numbers, quietly deciding who belongs in the future it's constructing. If you still want to believe in a mystical reset, I'm going to offer you something colder. A reset you can document. A reset that doesn't require hidden civilizations, only heat, wind, and the kind of opportunism that always follows ash. Chicago, 1871. You already know the headline version. A city burns, then rises. Americans love that story because it feels moral. Fire purifies. Fire tests character. Fire produces greatness. But that is mythology. Polite, patriotic, and dangerously incomplete. Because in the real mechanics of power, catastrophe is not a test. It's a lever. A great fire doesn't just destroy buildings. It destroys contracts. It destroys records. It destroys boundaries. It turns ownership into confusion, and confusion into opportunity. It creates a moment when law has to move faster than truth, because people demand answers. Investors demand clarity, and governments demand taxes and order. And when law moves faster than truth, guess who wins? Not the families sleeping in the cold. The first cruelty of disaster is obvious. The dead, the displaced, the hunger, the panic. The second cruelty is structural. The way catastrophe gives institutions permission to reshape the city. For safety, for progress, for modernization. Words that sound like medicine until you notice who pays and who profits. After a major fire, rebuilding isn't just construction. It's a political economy. Insurance money flows unevenly. Credit flows selectively. Permits appear conditionally. Building codes harden suddenly. And here's the part that should make you angry. Those changes are often necessary. Dense wooden cities are tinder. Sanitation matters. Fire breaks matter. Streets need order. But necessity is never neutral. In the hands of power, necessity becomes a script. We must rebuild better. And better usually means more expensive, more regulated, more legible, and therefore more accessible to those who already have capital. That's the real reset. Not a new population dropped into old streets, but a new hierarchy poured into the void left by disaster. Now connect it back to our governing question. When catastrophe breaks the record, who rebuilds continuity? In Chicago, the fire didn't just burn homes. It burned documents. Business papers, personal records, inventories, deeds, the little proofs that anchor ordinary lives to property and identity. People can survive a night of flame and still lose their future when their proofs turn to smoke. And then what happens? Reconstruction. City officials redraw. Courts adjudicate claims. Banks decide who is creditworthy. Developers decide what gets rebuilt and where. The rebuilt city doesn't just reflect a return, it reflects a choice, a forced rewrite of urban life under the banner of recovery. This is why the competitor script's infrastructure precedes population argument is emotionally convincing but historically sloppy. What it's sensing is real. After disasters, cities often rebuild in ways that look disproportionate, grand, unified, forward-looking, not because they inherited a hidden past, but because they are rebuilding for the future they want to impose. A burned city becomes a blank page, and blank pages attract planners. So, you get neoclassical civic buildings that project permanence. You get boulevards that project order. You get train stations that project destiny. You get a city rebuilt, not as it was, but as it should be, according to those with the power to define should. And here's the psychological trick. Once the new stone stands, it persuades you retroactively that the system was always competent, always stable, always continuous. The architecture becomes propaganda. It says, we endured, we improved, we earned this. But ask the bodies. Ask who was pushed outward when prices rose. Ask who lost land because proof was gone. Ask who became transient and therefore uncountable. Ask who got reclassified as a problem to be policed rather than a citizen to be restored. This is why reset is a dangerous word, because it sanitizes the mechanism. It makes structural violence sound like a mysterious event, rather than a predictable outcome of crisis economics. Chicago teaches the grim lesson in daylight. Catastrophe creates a permission slip to rewrite laws, a permission slip to rezone neighborhoods, a permission slip to restructure labor, a permission slip to rebuild identity through new paperwork, new addresses, new registries, new boundaries of belonging. And once you understand that, the empty streets of old photos stop being paranormal and start being political. Even if a photograph's emptiness is partly technical, there is a broader truth. Modernity often prefers to show cities as systems rather than people. It frames the street as an engineered corridor, not as a human ecosystem. Because systems are easier to govern than humans. So, Chicago is our real-world bridge from the 1700s seam to the 1800s image. It shows you what a reset looks like when you don't need fantasy. It looks like ash, then code, then stone, then a new story told as continuity. Open loop. If a fire can rewrite a city while everyone calls it recovery, then what happens when a state learns to use spectacle, not disaster, to perform the same rewrite in front of the world? A disaster rewrites a city in panic. A spectacle rewrites a city in daylight, while you applaud. That's what the world's fairs were at their most honest. Not just exhibitions of technology, but exhibitions of legitimacy. They weren't merely asking you to admire electricity or steel. They were teaching you how to feel about the system that owned electricity and steel. They were building a temporary heaven to make the new order feel inevitable and benevolent. And Chicago's 1893 World's Columbian Exposition is the cleanest example because it arrives like a confession. The White City, a coordinated neoclassical dreamscape, symmetry, grandeur, controlled vistas, architecture that looks eternal even when built to last a season, waterways, promenades, monumental halls, and then crowds, wonder, obedience. People walking through a manufactured future and learning without being told that progress has a face, and that face belongs to institutions. This is why the competitor script is obsessed with fairs. It senses something true. These events appear too quickly, look too unified, then disappear too completely. It wants that pattern to prove inheritance, buildings revealed, not built. But again, reality is uglier and more instructive. The fairs weren't proof of a hidden civilization. They were proof of something we pretend doesn't exist. Power can build an entire environment to program your imagination. The White City didn't need to be permanent. It needed to be convincing. It needed to feel like the real future, so that everything outside it felt outdated and shameful. It needed to make planners, financiers, and politicians look like priests of modernity. and it needed to make the public internalize a lesson. The system is capable, coordinated, and destined to lead. That's the psychology. Now the logistics. A World's Fair is a wartime operation without bullets. Supply chains, labor schedules, security, sanitation, transport, lighting, crowd control. An engineered experience. And like war, it runs on money and discipline, often on exploited labor and suppressed conflict. The fair is not an accidental miracle. It is a concentrated mobilization of resources to produce a narrative. And the narrative is never neutral. The White City arrives after Chicago's fire-era rebuilding and becomes the city's public baptism. Look, we have not merely recovered, we have transcended. We are not smoke and chaos, we are marble and order. We are civilized. We are the future. But future always has a cost, and the cost is often paid off stage. Because the fair doesn't just display architecture, it displays hierarchy. It tells you who is modern and who is primitive. It categorizes cultures, peoples, and histories into a ladder with the fair's organizers standing at the top. It turns a planet into a museum where some humans are exhibits and others are engineers. This is the moral engine of the spectacle. It makes domination feel educational. And then comes the key move, what the competitor script calls vanish too completely. Demolition. Officially, much of it was temporary construction, designed to be dismantled. That is true. But ask why the dismantling matters symbolically. Ask why the fair must disappear, leaving photographs and memory rather than permanent neighborhoods. Because permanence invites questions. Permanence invites claims. Permanence invites citizens to live inside the dream and demand that the dream standards apply to their real lives. A permanent white city would become an indictment. Why is the real city filthy while the show city is pure? So the fair leaves behind influence rather than substance. It leaves behind an aesthetic, a planning ideology, a myth of what a city should be. Clean, grand, controlled. And then planners take that myth and use it as justification to reshape real neighborhoods, often against the will of the people who live there. This is how spectacle becomes policy. It builds consent. And now we can connect this back to our governing question about continuity. Because the fair does something to history itself. It performs continuity in stone and light. It says, we are the inheritors of classical beauty. We are the managers of civilization. We are the rightful authors of progress. In other words, it doesn't just show you buildings, it shows you a lineage that legitimizes power. And when you have a society dealing with record seams, missing documents, reconstructed archives, populations shifted by war and industry, spectacle becomes a substitute for deep memory. People don't need to trace their family lines back centuries if they can walk through an environment that makes them feel part of a grand, unbroken story. A fair offers a ready-made ancestry, national triumph, industrial destiny, civilization as a straight line. That is why this matters more than the conspiracy angle. The fair isn't proof that history was fabricated. It's proof that history can be performed so convincingly that it becomes functionally true for millions of people. Because when enough people internalize the performance, it doesn't matter what the archive says. The performance becomes culture. The performance becomes education. The performance becomes the story you inherit. And now the cruelest part. the people least likely to benefit from the new order are also the people most likely to be turned into background, into blur, into absence. The fair frames them as labor, as crowd, as public, not as authors of the city. Their names don't survive. Their wages don't become monuments. Their losses don't become official memory. So the White City is not a relic of a hidden past. It's a demonstration of a hidden mechanism. Power doesn't only rebuild after catastrophe. It stages a future, so you'll accept the rebuild as destiny. And once you see that, you can predict what comes next. Because if spectacle can build consent for a new urban order, then paperwork can build the population that will inhabit that order, legible, assignable, governable. Which brings us to the most unsettling system of all, the one that turns children into documents. Open loop. If a World's Fair can manufacture a shared ancestry in one summer, what happens when institutions manufacture individual ancestry, one child at a time, through intake forms that replace blood with paperwork? You want to understand how a society repairs itself after rupture, without admitting rupture? Watch what it does with children. Because children are the perfect raw material for continuity. They don't carry long memories. They adapt. They can be renamed. They can be taught a story and live inside it, as if it was always theirs. And when institutions take control of children at scale, identity stops being only a family inheritance. It becomes something that can be administered. This is where the competitor script aims for the sensational. Millions of children with no lineage, origin unknown, replacement humans. It treats orphan records like evidence of a secret repopulation program. That's not how you need to read it to be horrified. The real horror is bureaucratic and completely legal. The 19th century, especially in the United States and parts of Europe, built systems that processed unwanted, poor, abandoned, and displaced children in industrial quantities, not from nowhere. From poverty, from disease, from urban overcrowding, from labor accidents, from family collapse under economic pressure, from migration, from war shockwaves, from the simple truth that modern cities produce orphans the way factories produce smoke. The orphan train movement, operating from the mid-1800s into the early 1900s, relocated enormous numbers of children from eastern cities to rural communities and families across the country. Not always into love, often into labor, often into silence. And here is the pivot that matters for our governing question: the paperwork. An intake form doesn't just record a child, it defines the child. Found. Parents deceased. Origin unknown. Details unavailable. These phrases sound like helplessness. Sometimes they were. Sometimes no one truly knew, especially when the child was too young to tell and the adults were gone. But the phrases also function as a kind of administrative amputation. They cut the child off from prior claims. They sever the past. They make the child portable. Portable children solve institutional problems. A city drowning in poverty can export its dependence. A rural community lacking labor can import help. A nation hungry for settlement can place bodies into prepared spaces. A charity can call it salvation, while a farmer calls it workforce. That's not a conspiracy. That's economics wearing a moral mask. And here is why this belongs inside the same story as censuses and World's Fairs. Because modern states and modern capitalism share a taste. They prefer people who are legible and placeable. They prefer identities that can be documented, moved, and assigned to a slot in the machine. If your birth is recorded, you can be taxed and schooled and drafted. If your family is stable, you can be traced and controlled through kinship. If your ancestry is unclear, you become a problem, unless the institution can rewrite your story into something usable. So what do orphan systems do? They replace messy lived identity with standardized institutional identity. They assign names. They assign guardianship. They assign residence. They assign, in effect, a new origin story that becomes real because it is the only story the child has documents for. This is not metaphor. It's the political psychology of continuity. When the archive is wounded, the archive rebuilds itself by creating citizens whose identities begin at the point where the institution first touched them. Now ask the moral question no sentimental retelling wants to ask. Who benefited? The child might benefit by surviving. That's not trivial. Survival matters. But survival is not the only metric. The receiving households benefited from labor. The sending cities benefited from reduced welfare burden. Charities benefited from legitimacy and donations. The state benefited from a population redistributed into roles that stabilized the economy. And the child paid a cost that doesn't show up on the balance sheet. Memory, name, origin, the right to know where you came from, not as a luxury, but as a human anchor. You want to see how continuity becomes policy? It happens right here. Because when a society cannot provide uninterrupted lineage for everyone, because poverty, migration, and crisis shred families, institutions step in and manufacture continuity at the level that matters most, the personal. They tell you who you are, where you belong, and what your past is allowed to be. And once enough people live inside those assigned identities, the macro story of society becomes smoother. Census numbers become more coherent because the population is now tracked. School records align. Marriage records align. Property claims align. The machine regains traction. The competitor script calls this insertion. It makes it sound alien, but the truth is more terrifying because it is normal. It is the normality of a modern society that can absorb human chaos by converting it into files. Now look back to the empty streets. Look back to the white city. You can feel the same impulse in all of it. The preference for clean lines over messy lives. The desire to make civilization look continuous, orderly, and inevitable, even if that requires trimming off the people who don't fit. That is why orphan records hit so hard. They reveal the seam where the human story becomes administrative story. And once you notice that seam, you start seeing it everywhere. In deportations, in boarding schools, in resettlement, in identity papers, in the difference between being a person and being a case number. So no, this is not proof that the world ended in 1700 and restarted. It is proof of something more actionable. Modern power learned to repair itself by controlling beginnings. And if you control beginnings, you can control everything that follows. Education, loyalty, labor, memory, open loop. If institutions can grant you a past through paperwork, what happens to the physical city that already existed? Its buried layers, its raised streets. When the same institutions decide which parts of the past must stay underground to keep the new continuity believable. If you want evidence that doesn't care what anyone believes, you don't start with photographs or theories. You start with stairs that go down to a front door. A building's entrance is a statement of intent. It tells you what the builders thought the ground was. It tells you where street level was supposed to be when the facade was designed to meet human eyes. So, when you find grand windows half buried, when you see decorative stonework sinking below modern pavement, when you walk down steps to enter what looks like it was meant to be a proud first floor, you are looking at a kind of urban confession. The city changed its skin. The competitor script takes this phenomenon and pushes it toward a single dramatic claim. Rapid deposition, sudden burial, a catastrophe that covered cities. Sometimes it hints at a global event. That's where it overreaches. But here is what it gets right. Raised streets are real, widespread, and politically meaningful, not because they prove a secret reset, but because they reveal a recurring pattern of how cities respond to crisis. When a city is forced to survive its own filth, it raises itself. The 19th century and early 20th century are full of grim motivations for this. Sanitation failures, cholera outbreaks, sewage systems that can't cope, flooding, mud streets turned into disease corridors, infrastructure upgrades that require new grades. Raising street levels can reduce flooding, allow new drainage, create room for pipes, and bury older, less sanitary layers. That's the clean explanation. It's often true, but true isn't innocent. Because changing street level is not just engineering, it's governance. It is deciding what parts of the past get entombed and what parts get showcased. It is literally reordering the city's memory into strata, some visible, some hidden. And the moment you accept that, you can see the same mechanism we've been tracking since part 1, continuity administered through selective preservation. A city is not one era. It is a stack of eras held together by politics and cement. Every time officials choose to pave over a district rather than restore it, every time they upgrade rather than excavate, every time they bury foundations instead of dismantling them, they are making a decision about what counts as the living city and what becomes the dead city underfoot. Now add disaster to that equation. After a fire, rebuilding often means new codes, new materials, and new street plans. After repeated floods, raising grades becomes a survival strategy. After epidemics, sanitation becomes a moral crusade. The city doesn't merely change. It is transformed under crisis mandates that few ordinary residents can resist. And here's the political psychology. Officials can frame these transformations as pure progress, public health, modernization, safety, while also using them to reshape neighborhoods, displace the poor, and erase inconvenient histories. Because if you raise a street, you don't just change drainage, you change rent values. You change which buildings are modern and which become basements. You change which businesses survive. You change who can afford to stay. And when people are forced out, the archive often follows the winners. The losers become the buried layer, socially as well as physically. This is why Buried Floors fits our story so precisely. It's the built environment version of what reconstruction does in paperwork. It covers the seam, stabilizes the surface, and calls the result continuity. But there's another dimension that ties back to war and fortresses. Cities aren't only raised for sanitation. Sometimes they're raised for control. A new grade can widen a street and improve troop movement. It can clear sightlines. It can eliminate alleys that shelter resistance. It can reconfigure space to make policing easier. Haussmann's Paris wasn't only about beauty, it was also about making rebellion harder. Boulevards as anti-barricade corridors. That's an old lesson in urban power. Geometry can be discipline. So when you see older entrances sinking below modern street level, you're seeing the residue of countless decisions where the state chose a version of the city that better served administration, commerce, and control. And now the philosophical punchline. Buildings endure, people do not. Stone survives fire better than families survive eviction. Brick survives floods better than records survive panic. Architecture can outlast memory long enough for later generations to misread it as proof of some grand, uninterrupted plan. But often, it's not proof of continuity at all. It's proof of adaptation after damage. Here is the most honest way to hold this without slipping into fantasy. The world does not need to end everywhere at once for cities to look like they were restarted. It only needs repeated crises severe enough to force infrastructure rewrites, followed by narratives strong enough to call those rewrites normal development. And those narratives are not just stories, they are policies. They determine what gets excavated, what gets paved, what gets preserved, what gets forgotten. So when you walk past a doorway that now requires steps down, don't immediately ask, was there a mud flood? Ask a more dangerous question. Who decided not to bring the old ground back? Because someone always decides. Someone approves budgets. Someone writes reports. Someone frames it as improvement. And someone benefits when the past is literally lowered beneath the present. That's why the buried floor is not a smoking gun for a secret reset. It's a mirror held up to modern governance, the state's ability to build a livable surface by burying the inconvenient layers beneath it. Open loop. If cities can bury their own past for health, order, and profit, what happens to personal history, your family history, when the same era produces the genealogy wall, the point where records stop and reconstruction begins? You can live without knowing your great-great-great-grandparents' names. Most people do. Life is already heavy enough without carrying centuries on your back. But the moment you try to trace the line, when you try to anchor yourself in deep time, you meet something that feels less like personal ignorance and more like a structural boundary. A wall, a recurring horizon where records thin, vanish, restart, or reappear as reconstructed. And the competitor script treats that wall like a siren, proof that the past was wiped, proof that people were inserted, proof that continuity is a fraud. Again, too dramatic, too clean. But the wall is real enough to deserve a harder question than conspiracy. Why does memory stop so reliably for so many people? And why does the modern world feel so invested in pretending that it doesn't matter? Here is the simplest explanation that isn't comforting. Most ordinary lives were not archived like royalty. Paper was expensive, literacy uneven, administration inconsistent, and preservation fragile. Fires, floods, war, and institutional reform pulverized records. Even without any central scheme, the archive is a battlefield where chaos often wins. But that explanation only covers part of it. It explains loss. It does not explain what happens next. What happens next is the point. After rupture comes repair, and repair comes with incentives. A modern state cannot function on permanent unknowns. It needs property lines. It needs inheritance chains. It needs tax obligations that can be assigned to households. It needs legal identity stable enough to prosecute, conscript, educate, and administer. So, when records are missing, the state does not shrug forever. It reconstructs. Courts accept substitutes. Churches reissue certificates. Cities standardize names and addresses. Bureaucracies consolidate files. All of this can be done in good faith, and still, the effect is the same. The official past becomes the past that is legally real. That is what the genealogy wall actually reveals. Not a supernatural reset, but a transition from lived continuity to documented continuity. And documented continuity has a brutal property. It is not symmetrical. It preserves the legible more than the illegible. It favors the settled over the displaced, the property holder over the renter, the citizen over the migrant, the married over the informal, the registered over the poor. So when you push your family line back and it disappears, you may not be staring at non-existence. You may be staring at the moment your ancestors fell outside the state's lens, outside the institutions that were allowed to preserve memory. This is where the philosophy of power becomes personal, because we like to imagine identity as blood, as something you carry inside you. But in the modern world, identity is also a relationship to records. And when that relationship breaks, you don't just lose trivia. You lose claims. You lose context. You lose the ability to prove you belong to a story older than your own lifetime. Now ask why the system prefers it that way. A population with deep, traceable memory can make demands. It can point to stolen land, broken promises, erased communities. It can name who benefited from past restructuring and who paid. Deep memory is not just sentimental, it is politically dangerous. So even when loss is accidental, the management of loss is rarely neutral. Institutions fill the gaps in ways that stabilize the present order. They choose the version of continuity that best supports property, taxation, borders, and legitimacy. And here is the psychological mechanism that makes it work. Humans hate voids. We prefer a smooth story to an honest whole. We prefer most likely to unknown. We prefer an ancestry we can repeat at weddings and funerals to the terror of admitting that large parts of our past are simply undocumented. So, we accept reconstruction. We accept the patch as fabric. We let the state's scar tissue become our skin. This is why the competitor script's final mood, paranoia, suspicion, the feeling that history is assigned, lands emotionally even when the claims overreach. Because beneath the exaggeration is a true wound. Modernity has created a world where the record often matters more than the lived experience, and where losing the record can make you socially invisible. And now we can connect every thread we've built. Empty streets that center buildings over people. Fortresses that turn space into permission. A capital built as a weapon. Censuses that draw borders around personhood. Disasters that authorize rewrites. Spectacles that perform legitimacy. Orphan systems that begin identities on paper. Cities that bury their own past to stabilize the surface. The genealogy wall is the personal version of all of that. It is the moment you realize continuity is not guaranteed by nature. It is maintained by institutions. And that leads us to the final act, where we answer the governing question without mysticism. When catastrophe breaks the record, who rebuilds continuity? And how does power turn reconstruction into legitimacy? Because once you see continuity as a policy, you stop asking whether history was true in some abstract sense and start asking the only question that matters. Who benefited from the version of the past that became official? Open loop. If continuity is administered, then the final question is not, did the world reset? It's darker. What does a society have to hide? And who does it have to erase so that the administered story feels like inheritance rather than control? We can stop pretending this is about a photograph. The empty street was bait. It did its job. It made you feel the chill of absence. And in that chill, the conspiracy narrative offers you a warm blanket, a reset, a vanished world, a hidden civilization, a mystery that absolves everyone because no one is responsible for a cosmic event. But history's real machinery doesn't need cosmic events. It needs incentives. And now we can answer the big question we planted back in Act 1. When Catastrophe shatters documentation, who gets to rebuild continuity? And how does power turn reconstruction into legitimacy? Here's the answer you won't like. Whoever still has institutions. Whoever still has courts, clerks, armies, warehouses, and the authority to make paper binding. Whoever can feed people long enough to make obedience feel like safety. Whoever can say, this is the official record, and have that sentence carry the force of law. Because Catastrophe does two things at once. It kills bodies, and it breaks the record of bodies. The first is tragedy. The second is opportunity. Not opportunity for evil masterminds in a candlelit room. Stop giving power that kind of romance. The opportunity is systemic. A broken record creates uncertainty, and uncertainty is poison to governance. Taxation needs names. Conscription needs addresses. Property needs continuity. Marriage needs certificates. Trade needs permits. Courts need evidence. Without documentation, the state cannot perform its basic functions without dissolving into violence and improvisation. So the state does the rational thing. It reconstructs. And reconstruction becomes legitimacy, because legitimacy is, at its core, a claim that the state's story is the story reality must obey. A reconstructed census becomes the basis for taxes. A reconstructed property register becomes the basis for ownership. A reconstructed genealogy becomes the basis for inheritance. These reconstructions don't stay maybe. They harden into law. They become enforceable. They become normal. This is what the competitor script gets emotionally right and intellectually wrong. It sees the hardening and assumes a secret. But the hardening is what bureaucracy does. Bureaucracy converts uncertainty into administrable truth. That conversion is not neutral. It favors whoever is easiest to administrate, and whoever already has leverage. If your family owns land and can produce witnesses, you remain continuous. If your family is poor, mobile, informal, or shattered by crisis, your continuity becomes fragile. If you are displaced, your name can be misspelled into a new identity. If you are an orphan, your beginning becomes the moment an institution touches you. In other words, continuity becomes a privilege distributed by record keeping. Now watch how every anomaly the competitor script piles up suddenly becomes legible. without any mystical reset. Empty streets in photographs? Early photography and architectural documentation can erase crowds. But beyond that, institutions prefer images of order. Buildings are the state's face. People are noise unless they serve the narrative. The archive preserves what authority commissions. Star forts across continents? Not a hidden global civilization, but a shared military logic driven by artillery and the circulation of engineers. Geometry spreads because war demands it. A city like St. Petersburg appearing too fast, not inheritance, but command. A capital built as a weapon is built quickly when the state is willing to pay with forced labor and human attrition. Census notes like estimated and adjusted. Not proof of insertion, but proof of governance under rupture. The state cannot tolerate unknowns, so it patches them, then enforces the patch as truth. Disaster rebuilding like Chicago? Not a magical restart, but a documented reset mechanism. Catastrophe breaks old constraints, law moves fast, capital reorganizes space, and the new order calls itself recovery. World's fairs like the White City, not remnants of a hidden past, but performances of legitimacy. Temporary heavens designed to program the public's imagination and justify real-world restructuring. Orphan systems, not replacement humans, but the institutional manufacturing of legible identity at scale. A child becomes governable when the file exists. Buried floors and razed streets? Not necessarily global catastrophe, but repeated crisis-driven infrastructure rewrites. Sanitation, flooding, control, modernization, where the city stabilizes the surface by burying layers beneath it. The genealogy wall, not evidence that ancestors didn't exist, but evidence that the state's record lens did not preserve all lives equally, and that reconstruction often favored the present order. So what ended the old world, really? Not a single day, not a hidden apocalypse. The old world ended the way systems end, by changing what counts as real. When identity becomes paper, the undocumented become ghosts. When governance becomes statistics, the uncounted become disposable. When cities become engineered corridors, the poor become obstacles. When history becomes a curated archive, those without institutional power become absence. And this is why the story is not about whether you should believe the reset hypothesis. Belief is cheap. Belief is entertainment. The story is about complicity. Because continuity doesn't only protect rulers, it protects the public from panic. People want stability. They want a past that makes sense. They want lineage. They want the comfort of a straight line from then to now. And in exchange for that comfort, they often accept the administered story, even when it's built on missing names. The most frightening possibility is not that institutions invented everything. It's simpler. They didn't need to. They only needed to smooth the seams. They only needed to choose which losses to record as tragedy and which to bury as paperwork. And the public helped, because the alternative, a past full of holes, discontinuities, and unpayable moral debts, is unbearable to live with. So here's the verdict, stated plainly. Continuity is a policy. It is maintained when it serves taxation, property, legitimacy, and social calm. It is repaired when catastrophe threatens the machine. And the repair always has a price, paid by the people whose lives are hardest to record. Now return to the photograph one last time. Market Square, Stockholm, circa 1890. Maybe the street is empty, because the exposure was long, and the photographer wanted clean architecture. Fine, that can be true. But even if it's true, the photograph still tells you something real. Something you can't unsee once you've learned to read the modern world. The built environment outlasts the human record. The archive outlasts the witness. And when the witness is gone, the institution writes the version of continuity that keeps the machine running. So the question you should carry out of this film is not, did the world reset? It's sharper. It's personal. It's political. If your identity depends on a record, who controls the record? And what are they willing to erase to keep the story smooth? When the ledger closes, the bones still speak.